Hello patrons, thank you for joining me. I hope very much that you will continue to follow me, Rob Caskie, proudly engaging in storytelling on this platform, and enjoy the human stories I like to share. I want to talk today about a remarkable Orcadian, a man who hailed from Orkney called Dr. John Rae, who lived from 1813 to 1893. He died at the ripe old age of 80. And when one considers the deprivations and the challenges of his life, it really is quite remarkable that he got to the age of 80. This man grew up as tough as they come in the Orkney Islands. He learned to sail and to hike and to fish and to hunt from a very early age. And he must have been bright because he qualified as a doctor at the age of 20. Now he is most well remembered and well known for his Arctic explorations and his Arctic journeys between the years of 1844 and 1854. But in 1844, when he arrived at the Hudson Bay Company, it turns out that the surveying instructor who was supposed to help him with the art of surveying was very sick. So John Rae, as a young man, took off on a 1,200-mile journey, executed largely by dog sled, around the northern shores of Lake Superior to get help from another surveying instructor at Sainte-Marie, and the surveying instruction clearly must have been outstanding. Well, John Rae is a man who was very, very highly regarded as a hunter and a shot. There's no doubt that his marksmanship was unequaled, and most of the journeys in which he embarked, he provided the bulk of the food by dint of being such a good marksman, hunter, and shot. He was a man who felt that the country should always support and feed its explorers. He was violently opposed to those huge British expeditions that had hitherto been the norm, and indeed it culminated in the death of John Franklin and 128 of the finest the Royal Navy could provide. John Rae also is extraordinary in the fact that he was a prodigious snowshoe walker. He could accomplish incredible distances walking on snowshoes. On some of the journeys that he was to perform, he walked an average of 14 miles a day and was able to survey, in so doing, thousands and thousands of miles of the Arctic, the Coppermine River, the Great Back River, and indeed a huge amount of land around the Boothia Peninsula, King William Island, and so forth. He never believed in sleeping bags. He simply wanted to dress warmly enough as the local Inuits and the Eskimos dressed. They carried tents with them on small sleds, and he, where the snow and the ice were suitable, would often build snow huts or igloos in which to live, which he felt were bigger and far more comfortable than the tents that they typically used for shelter. Now, he was very highly regarded by the Hudson Bay Company and officially was employed by them to work and do exploration and a huge amount of interaction between the HBC and the local Inuit population in the Arctic. Now, in 1850, he was able to get word from the Inuits that 4 years earlier, a number of men had been seen walking, Kabaluna they called them, these are white men, and the Inuit word for white men, had been walking on the southern end of King William Island, dragging boats. And from the descriptions of the Inuit, Rae was able to ascertain that one of the prominent leaders in that group was none other than Crozier, Francis Crozier, who was indeed captain of one of Franklin's two ships, the Erebus and the Terror. Well, Rae rushed back to England with this news, and of course the Royal Navy, and particularly Franklin's widow, Jane Franklin, put enough pressure on Rae to move back to the Arctic and to get more information regarding perhaps what had happened to Franklin's expedition. Jane held the remote possibility that they could be alive. Indeed, her husband, she hoped, was still alive and perhaps been given refuge and succor by some remote Inuit community. Well, the truth turned out to be very different. John Rae ascertained from the Inuit who'd visited the camp and indeed the place where more than 30 skeletons were found, and they led Rae to the place, that in the final throes, in a desperate attempt to remain alive, that these men of the Royal Navy had resorted to cannibalism. And indeed, the bones, some of the skeletons and the contents of the kettles and the pots at that final camp would clearly indicate that these men had been forced to resort to cannibalism to try and stay alive. Well, John Rae returned with this news, along with many artifacts that he had purchased from the Inuits, including a plate belonging to John Franklin, copper bands from the headgear of some of those soldiers and sailors, and indeed many artifacts, including crockery and cutlery, and even some rings from some of the men who had been with Franklin. And of course, when he returned with the story that these men had resorted to cannibalism, Britain and the backlash was absolutely meteoric. And Jane Franklin enlisted the help of one of the most prominent writers of the time, Charles Dickens, to vilify John Rae and to indicate very clearly that these British noblemen would never resort to cannibalism in order to stay alive. And as a result, the remainder of John Rae's life is almost covered in this dark shadow, where he was completely alienated and ostracized by Britain's society for bringing back the truth about what indeed had happened with John Franklin's men when they walked away from their ships trapped on the ice and had made their way down across King William Island towards the Great Fish River. They should instead have headed rather in a north-easterly direction towards Fury Beach, where a ship called the Fury some years earlier had been wrecked, leaving a huge amount of supplies and food. And indeed, if they had made the journey towards Fury Beach and the wreck of the Fury, the outcome may have been different to the one we're describing. But it's remarkable to consider that this man, who I think was a quite extraordinary athlete and hunter in his own right, and one of the great heroes of Orkney, would spend the remainder of his lives in obscurity to the time where he was finally called to rest at 80 years of age. There's a wonderful statue of him lying in his great Inuit overcoat with a shotgun, as he so often would protect himself and arm himself in the Arctic. But if you are interested in Arctic exploration and want to move away from the traditional exploration that always took place by way of ship, and perhaps one of our generation's incredible athletes who did all of his exploring on foot and covered the most remarkable distances, often with small groups of men, aided by local Inuit, and the deprivations they suffered are indescribable. There were times where moving down some of these big rivers, the canoes in which they traveled would be overturned. He lost men, indeed Inuit interpreters, some of his own men from the Hudson Bay Company, and local Inuit who were attempting to assist him. He was a man who was very considerate. He never smoked, but never objected to the fact that almost all of his men in these environments smoked. And a man who will be fondly remembered as one of the great Arctic explorers, and a man who's never been acknowledged for his contribution to Arctic exploration, largely on account of the controversy surrounding the end of Franklin and his men and their resorting in the final stages to cannibalism. But I hope you've enjoyed this little story about this famous Orcadian John Rae. I hope you might even be prompted enough to read a little about him and some of the journeys he embarked upon and the quite remarkable distances he covered literally on foot, feeding off the land, very, very lightly equipped, dragging a small sled and a tent, and feeding himself and his party off the land. I hope you'll continue to follow me on Patreon, and I look forward to continuing this journey together. Thank you very much.